The wildfire roared like a living beast across the ridge, devouring pine and sagebrush in its fury. And through the wall of smoke came a sight no one expected: a 70-year-old woman dragging buckets of water toward the flames with bloodied hands and eyes burning with defiance. Behind her, the cabin she'd vowed to defend stood alone against the inferno, a fragile promise in a merciless land. But this wasn't her home. She'd arrived only weeks before, a stranger cast aside by a world that no longer wanted her. So why would she risk everything to save it? If you want to know how a forgotten cook became the fiercest soul on the frontier, stay with me until the end of this story. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this tale can travel. The valley had a way of swallowing sound. It sat wedged between two mountain ridges like a scar carved into the earth, wide enough for a few scattered homesteads, but narrow enough that the wind always seemed to be listening. The grass grew thin and yellow, the creek ran cold and stingy, and the sky pressed down heavy most days, pale as old bone. It was the kind of place that didn't forgive mistakes, the kind of place where people came to disappear. Caleb Rourke had been disappearing there for 7 years. His cabin squatted at the far end of the valley, a rough-hewn structure of split logs and tar paper that looked like it had grown out of the dirt rather than been built on top of it. The roof sagged on one side. The porch creaked with rot. Inside, the air smelled of old smoke, damp wool, and the faint sourness of unwashed dishes piled beside a rusted pump. A single chair sat before the cold hearth. One plate, one fork, one cup. Caleb liked it that way. He was a man built for silence. Tall, raw-boned, with hands scarred from years of breaking rock and driving fence posts into frozen ground. His face was weathered to the color of tanned leather, lined deep around the eyes and mouth, and his beard grew in uneven patches of black and gray. He moved with the slow economy of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on anything that didn't matter. And not much mattered anymore. The crops had failed again that spring. Too little rain, too much wind. The soil turned to dust, and the seed he'd scraped together enough money to buy never took root. He'd tried planting twice, then gave up. Now he worked odd jobs for the bigger ranches when they'd have him, mending fence, hauling timber, digging wells. But the pay was thin and the work was getting harder to come by. Men half his age could do it faster. The only company he kept was an aging hound named Dust, a mottled gray dog with cloudy eyes and a limp in his back leg. Dust spent most of his days sleeping on the porch, rising only when Caleb came home at dusk. The dog didn't bark anymore, didn't chase rabbits, just watched the valley with the same tired patience as his owner. It was a life stripped down to bone, and Caleb had convinced himself that was enough. Then, one blistering afternoon in late July, she appeared. Caleb was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the sound, faint at first, almost lost beneath the buzz of cicadas and the hiss of wind through the dry grass. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and squinted toward the trail that wound down from the ridge. A lone figure emerged from the heat shimmer, riding a sway-backed mule with a bedroll strapped behind the saddle. The rider sat upright, shoulders square despite the weight of the sun. And as they drew closer, Caleb realized with a start that it was a woman, an old woman. She wore a faded calico dress patched at the elbows, a wide-brimmed hat tied under her chin, and boots so scuffed they might have been older than the mule. Her face was thin and lined, weathered by decades of sun and hardship, but her eyes were sharp, pale blue and unyielding, like winter sky over stone. She reined the mule to a stop just outside the fence line and looked down at him without smiling. "This the Rourke place?" she asked. Her voice was dry, steady, with the faint rasp of someone who'd spent years talking over cook fires in crowded bunkhouses. Caleb set the axe against the stump and walked toward her, wary. Strangers didn't come this far into the valley without reason. "It is," he said carefully. "What do you want?" The woman studied him for a moment, then dismounted with a stiff grace that spoke of old injuries and stubborn will. She looped the mule's reins over the fence and turned to face him fully. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Heard you might need a cook." Caleb blinked. "Who told you that?" "Man at the supply post. Said you'd been buying beans and hardtack for months. Said you looked like you could use a decent meal." He felt a flicker of annoyance. The supply post was 20 miles south, and the man who ran it, Carter, a gossipy old fool, had no business sending anyone up here, least of all a woman who looked like she should be sitting on a porch somewhere with grandchildren at her feet. "I don't need a cook," Caleb said flatly. "Maybe not," the woman replied, "but you need something. That much is plain." Her tone wasn't sharp, but it carried a weight that made him bristle. He crossed his arms. "I manage fine on my own." "I'm sure you do." She glanced past him at the cabin, taking in the sagging roof, the weeds choking the door, the scatter of rusted tools in the yard. "Looks real fine." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for your opinion." "No," she agreed. "But I'm giving it anyway. Name's Evelyn Ward. I worked 23 years as a cook at the Double Creek Ranch until they decided I was too old to keep up. Told me they needed someone younger, someone faster." She paused, and for the first time her voice softened just a fraction. "They gave me a month's pay and a mule and told me good luck." Caleb said nothing. He'd heard stories like that before. Ranches were brutal that way. Use a person up, then cast them aside the moment they slowed down. It was the way of things. Evelyn met his eyes again. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Rourke. I'm asking for a chance to earn my keep, 1 week. You don't like the work, I'll move on. But I need a roof, and you need better than beans." He wanted to say no. Wanted to send her back down the trail before she complicated the quiet he'd worked so hard to carve out. But something in her stance, proud, unbending, refusing to beg, stirred something uncomfortable in him. Maybe it was the way she didn't flinch under his gaze. Maybe it was the fact that he'd been eating the same tasteless slop for months, and his stomach had started to forget what real food was. Or maybe it was just that he was tired of talking to a dog. 1 week, he said finally. "Trial basis. You sleep in the loft, I don't pay much." "Don't need much," Evelyn said. "Just need honest." She held out her hand. Caleb hesitated, then shook it. Her grip was firm, calloused, the hand of someone who'd worked hard all her life. "Stable's around back," he said, nodding toward the mule. "You can put her there. Supper's at sundown." Evelyn inclined her head and led the mule away without another word. Caleb stood in the yard, watching her go, and felt the first stirrings of doubt settle in his chest. What the hell had he just agreed to? That first evening, Evelyn worked in silence. She asked no questions, made no complaints. She simply moved through the cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd cooked in 100 different kitchens and knew how to make do with whatever she found. Which, in Caleb's case, wasn't much. She swept the floor, scrubbed the dishes, wiped down the table and the counters. Then she rummaged through his meager pantry, beans, flour, lard, a sack of wrinkled potatoes, and a jar of honey so old it had crystallized, and set to work. Caleb sat in his chair by the empty hearth, pretending to read an old newspaper but watching her out of the corner of his eye. She moved slowly, but with purpose. Her hands were steady as she peeled potatoes, cut salt pork into thin strips, and set a pot over the fire to heat. She didn't hum or chatter or fill the air with noise. She just worked. By the time the sun sank behind the ridge and the cabin filled with the smell of frying pork and roasted potatoes, Caleb's stomach was growling so loudly he was sure she could hear it. Evelyn set a plate in front of him without ceremony. "Eat while it's hot." He looked down at the food, crispy pork, potatoes browned in the drippings, a spoonful of beans seasoned with something he couldn't name, and felt his throat tighten. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't even complicated, but it was the first real meal he'd eaten in months. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The flavors hit him all at once, salt and smoke and richness, and for a moment he forgot to chew. Just sat there, stunned, as warmth spread through him in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Evelyn sat across from him with her own plate, eating slowly, her gaze distant. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. She glanced up, surprised. "For what?" "For this." He gestured at the plate. "It's good." Evelyn's expression softened just a fraction. "It's what I do, Mr. Rourke. Only thing I've ever been good at." "Caleb," he said. "Just Caleb." She nodded. "Evelyn." They ate in silence after that, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin and the crackle of the fire. And for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Evelyn rose before dawn, built the fire, and started coffee while Caleb tended to dust and checked the fence line. She cooked breakfast, simple, filling, and had it waiting when he came back inside. Then she cleaned, mended, and organized while he worked outside, repairing what he could and ignoring what he couldn't. She didn't talk much, and neither did he. But her presence filled the silence in a way that felt less like intrusion and more like accompaniment. On the third day, a boy appeared at the edge of the property. Caleb noticed him first. A skinny kid, maybe 9 or 10, standing barefoot in the dirt with hollow eyes and clothes that hung off him like rags. He didn't speak, just stood there watching the cabin with the wary stillness of a stray dog. Evelyn saw him through the window and stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "You hungry?" she called. The boy didn't answer, but he didn't run either. Evelyn walked back inside, filled a tin plate with cornbread and beans, and carried it out to the porch. She set it down on the top step, then retreated into the cabin without a word. Caleb watched from the window. The boy waited a long moment, then crept forward, snatched the plate, and disappeared into the trees. "What was that about?" Caleb asked. "Valley's full of kids like that," Evelyn said quietly. "Families too poor to feed them all. They wander, forage, starve sometimes." She looked at him. "You got objections?" Caleb hesitated. Food was scarce. Money was scarce. He couldn't afford to feed every hungry mouth that wandered by, but he thought of the boy's hollow eyes and said nothing. The next day the boy came back, and the day after that. By the end of the week there were 2 more, a girl with tangled hair and a toddler who clung to her skirt. Evelyn fed them all. She never asked for permission, never made a fuss. Just set out plates and let them eat on the porch while she worked inside. And when they were done, they vanished back into the valley like ghosts. Caleb didn't stop her. He told himself it was because arguing with her seemed pointless. But the truth, buried somewhere deeper, was that watching her feed those children stirred something in him he thought had died long ago. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. Not everyone in the valley saw it that way. One afternoon, Caleb rode into the nearest town, a cluster of weathered buildings huddled around a single dirt road, to pick up supplies. He hitched his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door jangling weakly. The store was dim and cluttered, smelling of leather and tobacco. Behind the counter stood Horace Finch, a wiry man with suspicious eyes and a talent for gossip. "Heard you hired yourself a cook," Horace said, not bothering with pleasantries. Caleb set his list on the counter. "That's right. Old woman from Double Creek, they say." "She's got a name," Horace snorted. "She's got an age, too. What are you thinking, Rourke? You gone soft?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "She works. That's all that matters." "Works slow, I'd bet." Horace leaned against the counter, grinning. "Bet she can't keep up with a real ranch cook. Bet she burns half what she makes." Caleb picked up a sack of flour and dropped it onto the counter hard enough to make Horace flinch. "You done?" Horace raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just saying what everyone's thinking. World's got no use for the old and the slow. You do better hiring someone with a little more life left in him." Caleb stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. But the encounter stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts as he rode back to the valley. The world discards people once they slow down. He'd always known that, accepted it as a fact of frontier life. But hearing it said so casually, hearing it treated like common sense, made something twist inside him. Because if that was true, then what did it say about him? What did it say about all of them? Autumn. That night, Evelyn set supper on the table, roasted rabbit, wild greens, and the last of the bread, and sat down across from him. "You seem troubled," she said quietly. Caleb looked up, surprised. He hadn't realized it showed. "Just thinking," he muttered. "About what?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "About what people are saying, about you being here." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "Let me guess. They think you're a fool for hiring an old woman." "Something like that." She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected as much. "People always think that. They think age makes you useless, makes you a burden." She paused, her gaze distant. "Maybe they're right." "They're not," Caleb said, the word surprising even him. Evelyn looked at him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "You've done more in a week than I've managed in months," he continued. "This place, it feels different now, better." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she smiled, small, sad, and genuine. "Thank you, Caleb." They finished the meal in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Warmer, less alone. The weeks passed, and summer deepened its grip on the valley. The heat grew brutal, relentless, baking the earth until it cracked. The creek shrank to a trickle. The grass turned brittle and yellow. At night the air hung heavy and still, and the stars seemed closer than they should, burning bright against the black. Evelyn worked through it all with the same quiet determination. She rationed water, cooked meals that stretched ingredients further than they had any right to go, and never once complained. The children kept coming. Some days it was just the boy. Other days, a handful of them, thin and wide-eyed, clutching each other's hands. Evelyn fed them all, and Caleb stopped pretending he didn't notice. He even started leaving extra firewood on the porch for her. Small things. Unspoken. But the cabin had changed. It no longer felt like a place where a man went to wait for the end. It felt like something worth defending. And when the fire came, that's exactly what it became. The smoke arrived first. It crept over the ridge one morning in late August, a thin gray haze that clung to the air and made the sunlight hazy. Caleb noticed it while checking the fence line and felt his stomach drop. Fire season. He scanned the horizon, searching for the telltale glow of flames, but saw nothing yet. Just smoke, drifting, waiting. By midday, the valley was buzzing with panic. Riders from the neighboring ranches galloped past, shouting warnings. The fire had started in the dry timber to the west and was spreading fast, driven by the wind. Everyone able-bodied was being called to fight it, digging fire breaks, hauling water, beating back the flames with wet blankets. Caleb saddled his horse without hesitation. This was the unspoken rule of the frontier. When fire came, you fought together or you died alone. Evelyn met him at the door as he was leaving. "You're going," she said. Not a question. "Have to." She nodded, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "I'll keep watch here. If it turns, you run. Understand? Don't wait for me. Just go." "I understand." But something in her tone told him she had no intention of running. Caleb hesitated, wanting to say more, but the shouts of the other men were already fading into the distance. He spurred his horse forward and rode hard toward the smoke. The fire was worse than he'd imagined. It roared across the hillside like a living thing, consuming everything in its path: trees, brush, fence posts, entire homesteads reduced to ash in minutes. The heat was overwhelming, a wall of scorching air that made it hard to breathe, and the smoke choked the sky black. Caleb worked alongside men he barely knew, digging trenches and hauling buckets until his hands blistered and his lungs burned. They fought for hours, desperate and exhausted, but the fire was relentless. And then the wind shifted. It came suddenly, a gust that roared down from the ridge and sent the flames veering east, toward the valley, toward his land. Panic surged through him. Caleb dropped his shovel and ran for his horse, ignoring the shouts of the other men. He had to get back, had to make sure Evelyn had gotten out. He rode hard, the smoke thickening around him, the heat growing unbearable. His heart pounded in his chest as he crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley. What he saw stopped him cold. The cabin still stood, and in front of it, alone, was Evelyn. She was hauling buckets of water from the well, her dress soaked, her face streaked with soot. The fire was closing in from three sides, the flames licking at the dry grass, and she was fighting it alone. "Evelyn!" Caleb shouted, spurring his horse down the slope. She didn't stop, didn't even look up, just kept hauling water, throwing it onto the flames, moving with grim determination. Caleb leaped from his horse and grabbed her by the shoulders. "What the hell are you doing? I told you to run!" She yanked herself free, glaring at him with fierce, unyielding eyes. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not while there's still something worth saving." The flames roared closer. The heat was unbearable now, searing his skin even from a distance. Caleb looked at the cabin, then at Evelyn, and realized with a sinking dread that she wasn't going to back down. She never had. "Then we fight together," he said, and together they turned to face the fire. No. End of part 1. The first bucket of water hit the flames with a hiss that sounded like a scream. Steam erupted in a cloud, momentarily obscuring the fire's advance. But within seconds, the blaze had swallowed the wet patch and continued its hungry march toward the cabin. Caleb threw another bucket, then another, his arms burning with the effort. Beside him, Evelyn worked with mechanical precision, her movement slower than his but no less determined. Sweat poured down her face, carving clean tracks through the soot, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "The horses!" she shouted over the roar. "They're still in the stable!" Caleb's head snapped toward the weathered structure behind the cabin. Through the thickening smoke he could see it, could hear the terrified screams of the animals inside, the thunder of hooves against wood as they panicked. "I'll get them," he yelled back. "You keep the cabin wet." He didn't wait for her response, just dropped his bucket and ran toward the stable, the heat intensifying with every step. The air was so hot it hurt to breathe, searing his lungs with each inhalation. Embers drifted down like malevolent snow, landing on his shirt and burning tiny holes in the fabric. The stable door was stuck. Caleb grabbed the handle and pulled, but the warped wood had swollen in the frame. Inside, the horses were screaming, throwing themselves against the stalls in blind terror. He could smell their fear mixed with smoke and hay, and beneath it all the first acrid scent of burning wood. "Come on, damn you!" He braced his foot against the frame and yanked with everything he had. The door gave way so suddenly he stumbled backward, nearly falling. Smoke poured out of the opening in a black wave. Caleb plunged inside, squinting against the stinging air. There were 3 horses, his own gelding, Evelyn's mule, and an old mare he'd bought cheap 2 years ago and never bothered to sell. All 3 were wild with panic, their eyes rolling white, foam flecking their mouths. He moved to the first stall, fumbling with the latch. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, and the simple mechanism felt impossibly complex. Finally, it clicked open, and the gelding exploded past him, nearly trampling him in its desperation to escape. 1 down. The mule was next. It brayed and kicked at the stall door, but Caleb managed to get it open without getting his ribs caved in. The animal bolted into the smoke-filled yard. 2 down. The mare was in the back corner, the farthest from the door, and as Caleb approached, he saw with sinking dread that flames had already found the back wall. They crawled up the dry wood with terrible speed, feeding on decades of accumulated dust and hay. The mare reared and screamed, her hooves slamming against the stall with enough force to crack the boards. "Easy, girl," Caleb murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the roar of the fire. "Easy now." He reached for the latch just as a burning beam crashed down from the ceiling, missing him by inches. Sparks exploded across his back, and he felt the sharp sting of burns through his shirt. But his hands found the latch and threw it open, and the mare surged past him in a blur of muscle and terror. Caleb turned to follow, and froze. The doorway was gone. Not literally gone, but blocked by a wall of flame that had sprung up in the seconds he'd spent freeing the mare. The fire had traveled along the hay scattered across the stable floor, igniting it in a hungry rush, and now it stood between him and escape. His mind went blank with primal fear. Then he heard Evelyn's voice, distant and sharp, cutting through the chaos. "Caleb, the back wall! Kick it out!" He spun around. The back wall was burning, yes, but it was also old, rotted in places, held together more by habit than structural integrity. If he could break through it, he didn't let himself think, just ran at the wall and drove his shoulder into it with all his weight. Pain exploded through his arm and chest, but the wood splintered. He hit it again. On the third impact, a section gave way completely, and he tumbled out into the open air, landing hard on his back in the dirt. For a moment he just lay there, gasping, staring up at the smoke-choked sky. Then hands grabbed him, small, strong hands, and hauled him to his feet. Evelyn. "Can you stand?" she demanded. "Yeah." His voice was a croak. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're bleeding." He looked down and saw she was right. His hands were torn and bleeding from the splintered wood, and his shirt was burned through in several places, revealing angry red skin beneath. But none of it mattered because the fire was still coming. The flames had reached the cabin now, licking at the base of the porch, testing the old wood for weakness. The heat was so intense that standing 20 feet away felt like standing in front of a forge. Evelyn's careful work, the buckets of water she'd thrown, the wet cloths she'd draped over the roof, had bought them time, but not much. "We need more water," Caleb said, though even as he spoke, he knew it was hopeless. The well was nearly dry from the drought, and what little remained wouldn't be enough to stop this. Evelyn seemed to come to the same conclusion. She looked at the cabin, then at him, and her expression hardened into something resolute and terrible. "Then we make a choice," she said quietly. "What do we save?" Caleb stared at her. "What?" "We can't save everything, so we choose." She gestured toward the cabin. "What's inside that matters." His mind reeled. Inside the cabin were his few possessions: clothes, tools, a rifle, the old newspaper he'd been reading the night she arrived. Nothing of real value, nothing worth dying for, except "your things," he said suddenly. "Your bedroll. Your—" "Already out?" Evelyn interrupted. She pointed to a bundle near the well, barely visible through the smoke. "Moved it this morning when I saw the smoke on the ridge. I'm not asking about my things, Caleb. I'm asking about yours." He couldn't answer, because the truth was that nothing inside that cabin mattered anymore. Not the way it used to. The things that had defined his solitary existence, the single chair, the single plate, the crushing silence, all of it felt suddenly trivial in the face of the fire's rage. "There's nothing," he said finally. "Let it burn." Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for certainty, then nodded. "Then we focus on what's alive," she said. "The animals, the well, and us." She grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the cabin just as the porch collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. The sound was like a death rattle, a low, groaning crash that seemed to echo across the entire valley. They retreated to the well, where Evelyn had already soaked several blankets and piled rocks in a rough semicircle to create a makeshift fire break. It wasn't much, but it was something. The freed horses had fled toward the creek, their survival instincts overriding their terror, and dust, faithful, ancient dust, had followed them, limping as fast as his old legs would carry him. Caleb and Evelyn crouched behind the stones, wrapping the wet blankets around their shoulders as the fire swept over the land like a tidal wave. The heat was unbearable, an oppressive force that seemed to press down on them from all sides. Smoke filled Caleb's lungs until he was coughing so hard he thought his ribs would crack. And still Evelyn didn't run. She knelt beside him, her face set in grim determination, and when the flames came within 10 feet of their position, she simply pulled the blanket tighter and met the inferno's gaze without flinching. "Why?" Caleb gasped between coughs. "Why didn't you leave when I told you to?" Evelyn didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, watching its terrible dance. "Because I've spent my whole life being told when to leave," she said quietly. "Told I was too slow, too old, too much trouble, and I got tired of listening." A burning branch fell near them, close enough that Caleb could feel the heat radiating from it. He kicked it away with his boot. "You could have died," he said hoarsely. "So could you." She finally turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw something fierce and unbroken. "But we didn't, and we won't. Not today." Her certainty was maddening, inspiring, terrifying. Caleb wanted to argue, to tell her that courage without sense was just foolishness. But the words died in his throat because somewhere deep down he understood. She hadn't stayed to save the cabin. She'd stayed to prove that she still could, that the world hadn't won yet, that there was still something in her worth fighting for. And maybe, the same was true of him. The fire roared closer. Embers fell like rain. The air shimmered with heat and fury. And then, from somewhere beyond the smoke, came a sound that didn't belong. Thunder. Caleb's head snapped up. Through the haze, he could see the sky darkening, clouds rolling in from the east with impossible speed. The wind shifted again, bringing with it the smell of rain, clean and cold and utterly out of place in the middle of August. "Is that—" he started. "A storm," Evelyn whispered. "It's a storm." Lightning split the sky, bright and jagged, illuminating the churning clouds. Another rumble of thunder followed, deeper this time, shaking the ground beneath them. And then, with a suddenness that felt almost miraculous, the rain began. It started as scattered drops, fat and heavy. hissing where they struck the flames. Then it intensified, becoming a downpour so fierce it was like standing beneath a waterfall. Within seconds, Caleb was drenched, the water streaming down his face and soaking through his burned clothes. The fire fought back for a moment, hissing and spitting in defiance, but it was no match for the deluge. Steam rose in great billowing clouds as the flames were smothered, choked, drowned beneath the weight of the rain. Caleb stood slowly, his legs trembling, and looked around in disbelief. The cabin was gone, collapsed into a smoldering ruin of charred beams and ash. The stable was a skeleton of blackened wood. The yard was scorched and barren, every blade of grass reduced to carbon. But the well still stood. The firebreak had held. And beside him, soaked and shivering but very much alive, was Evelyn. She was laughing. It was a raw, breathless sound, edged with hysteria and relief, and something that might have been triumph. She tipped her face up to the rain and laughed until tears mixed with the water streaming down her cheeks. Caleb stared at her, stunned, and then, against all reason, he started laughing too. They stood there in the ruins of his homestead, two battered survivors in the middle of a downpour, and laughed until their sides ached and their voices gave out. Because they were alive. Because the fire had lost. Because sometimes, against all odds, the world showed mercy. When the laughter finally faded, Evelyn wiped her eyes and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. "We should find the animals," she said hoarsely. "Make sure they're safe." Caleb nodded, still too dazed to speak. Together, they walked through the rain toward the creek. The horses and the mule were huddled beneath a rocky overhang, wet and skittish but unharmed. Dust lay nearby, panting hard, his gray coat plastered to his ribs. When he saw Caleb, he thumped his tail weakly against the ground. "Good boy," Caleb murmured, kneeling beside him. "Good boy." Evelyn checked each animal methodically, running her hands over their legs and flanks, looking for injuries. Finding none, she sank down onto a flat stone and closed her eyes. "We'll need to rebuild," she said after a long silence. Caleb looked back toward what had been his cabin. The rain was already washing away the ash, revealing the skeletal remains beneath. It would take months to rebuild, maybe longer, and he had almost no money, no materials, no help. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We will." Evelyn opened her eyes and regarded him steadily. "You sure you want me staying for that? Might take a while." He met her gaze and realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that he couldn't imagine doing it without her. "I'm sure," he said. She smiled, small and tired, but genuine. "All right then." They sat together in the rain, watching the last of the smoke rise and dissolve into the gray sky. And for the first time since the fire began, Caleb allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. They'd lost almost everything. And yet, somehow, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like a beginning. The rain continued through the night, steady and relentless, soaking the scorched earth and filling the depleted creek until it ran fast and cold. Caleb and Evelyn took shelter beneath the overhang with the animals, wrapped in the soaked blankets and shivering in the dropping temperature. Neither of them slept much. Every time Caleb closed his eyes, he saw flames, felt the searing heat, heard the crash of the collapsing cabin. But when dawn finally broke, pale and gray through the lingering clouds, the world looked different, washed clean, raw, ready to begin again. They walked back to the homestead together as the first light touched the valley. The destruction was worse in daylight, more complete, more final. The cabin was nothing but a blackened footprint in the dirt, a few charred beams jutting up like broken bones. The stable was gone entirely. Even the fence posts had burned, reduced to stumps. Evelyn stood in the center of the ruin, her arms crossed, surveying the damage with the same calm assessment she'd brought to her first day's work. "We'll need lumber," she said. "Nails, tar paper for the roof, tools if yours burned." "Most of them did," Caleb admitted. "Rifle, too." She nodded, making mental calculations. "How much money do you have?" He hesitated, then told her the truth. "Not enough." "Then we'll make do." She turned to look at him. "I've got a little saved. Not much, but enough to get started. We pool what we have, buy what we can, scavenge the rest." "Evelyn, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," she interrupted firmly. I'm offering. This is my home now too, Caleb, at least for as long as you'll have me. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that she didn't owe him anything, that she should take her savings and find somewhere safer, somewhere easier. But the words stuck in his throat because the truth was that he needed her, not just her work or her cooking or her stubborn refusal to give up. He needed her presence, her voice, the way she moved through the world with quiet dignity and refused to let it break her. "All right," he said finally. "We do it together." Evelyn extended her hand and they shook on it, a pact sealed in ash and rain. Over the next few days, they worked to salvage what they could from the ruins. Caleb dug through the charred remains of the cabin and found a few things that had survived. A cast iron pot, miraculously intact. A handful of nails, a single plate. Evelyn recovered her bedroll and the small trunk she'd brought with her, both of which had been far enough from the fire to escape damage. Everything else was gone. They set up a temporary camp near the well, stringing a tarp between two scorched trees to create a crude shelter. It wasn't much, barely enough to keep the rain off, but it was functional. Evelyn fashioned a cooking area using stones and the salvaged pot, and somehow, impossibly, she managed to make a decent stew from the meager supplies they had left. On the third day, the first visitors arrived. Caleb heard them coming before he saw them. The rattle of a wagon, the low murmur of voices. He straightened from where he'd been sorting through debris and turned to see a pair of riders approaching, followed by a heavy wagon loaded with lumber and supplies. He recognized them immediately. Ben Mercer and his son Tom, from the neighboring ranch to the south. Ben was a grizzled man in his 60s with a face like weathered saddle leather and hands the size of shovels. Tom was younger, quieter, with his father's build but his mother's gentle eyes. "Heard you got hit hard," Ben called as he reined his horse to a stop. "Came to see if the stories were true." Caleb gestured at the ruins around them. "True enough." Ben dismounted and walked over, his gaze sweeping across the destruction. He let out a low whistle. "Hell of a thing. You lose anyone?" "No, we got out." "We?" Ben's eyes shifted to Evelyn, who had emerged from beneath the tarp, wiping her hands on her apron. Recognition flickered across his face. "You're the cook from Double Creek." "Was," Evelyn corrected quietly. "Now I'm here." Ben studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if coming to some internal decision. "Well, you picked a hell of a time to move. Fire took out half the valley." "We noticed," Caleb said dryly. Tom hopped down from the wagon and began unloading planks of wood. "We brought what we could spare, figured you'd need it." Caleb stared at the supplies. Rough-cut lumber, a box of nails, several rolls of tar paper, even a few tools. It was more than he'd dared hope for. "I can't pay you for this," he said, his voice tight. "Didn't ask you to," Ben replied gruffly. "Fire takes from all of us. We help each other rebuild, or we all go under. That's how it works out here." Tom nodded in agreement, already hauling a bundle of planks toward the cleared foundation site. "Besides, word is you and the old woman fought that fire alone till the rain came. Takes grit to do that." Evelyn stiffened slightly at "old woman's," but her expression remained neutral. Ben noticed. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "What Tom means is, you did good work, both of you. Saved what mattered." "Thank you," Evelyn said simply. They worked together through the morning, laying the foundation for a new cabin. It was slow, hard work, made harder by the fact that Caleb's hands were still torn and blistered from the fire. But Ben and Tom didn't complain, and they didn't ask questions. They just worked. By midday, another wagon arrived, this one driven by a woman named Sarah Holloway, who ran a small farm on the eastern edge of the valley. She brought food, fresh bread, smoked meat, a sack of potatoes, and a jar of preserved peaches. "Heard you lost everything," she said, handing the supplies to Evelyn. "Figured you could use a decent meal." Evelyn accepted the food with quiet gratitude, and Sarah stayed long enough to help cook lunch for the workers. As they ate, more people began to arrive, ranch hands, farmers, even a few townsfolk from the settlement to the south. Some brought supplies, others brought labor. A few just brought company. By sunset, the foundation was complete, and the frame of the new cabin was beginning to take shape. Caleb stood back, exhausted and aching, and stared at the skeletal structure in disbelief. When he'd woken that morning, he'd expected to spend the day alone, scavenging scraps and trying to figure out how to survive the coming winter. Instead, he was surrounded by people, helping, without being asked. It was unsettling, humbling, and strangely moving. Ben clapped him on the shoulder as he prepared to leave. "We'll be back tomorrow. Should have the walls up by week's end if the weather holds." "I don't know how to thank you," Caleb said hoarsely. "Don't need thanks. Just do the same for the next man when his turn comes." Ben glanced at Evelyn, who was distributing the last of Sarah's bread to the departing workers. "And take care of that one. She's got more spine than most men I know." Caleb followed his gaze and felt something tighten in his chest. "I will." As the last of the visitors disappeared down the trail, Evelyn walked over to stand beside him. They looked at the beginnings of the new cabin in silence. "People surprised you today," she said quietly. "Yeah." "Why?" Caleb considered the question. "I guess I'd forgotten what it was like. People helping each other, looking out for their neighbors. I've been alone so long I started thinking that was just how things were." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It's how things are if you let them be, but it doesn't have to be." She paused, then added softly, "You're not alone anymore, Caleb." He looked at her, this small, weathered woman who'd arrived on his doorstep with nothing but pride and a will to work, who'd refused to run when the fire came, who'd stood beside him in the smoke and rain and laughed in the face of destruction. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not." They stood together as the sun set behind the scorched ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked too much like fire but somehow felt different, like a promise, like hope. The cabin rose from the ashes over the next 2 weeks, like something defiant and necessary. It wasn't the same cabin. The new structure was smaller, simpler, built with whatever lumber the valley could spare and assembled by hands that knew hardship. The walls went up crooked in places, and the roof sat at a slight angle that would probably leak come spring, but it stood. That was what mattered. It stood, and it had a door that closed, and windows that let in light, and a hearth that Caleb rebuilt stone by stone with his own blistered hands. Evelyn worked beside him every day, measuring and cutting and hammering with a precision that belied her age. She didn't complain when the work was hard or when her back ached so badly she had to sit for 10 minutes just to catch her breath. She simply kept going, one board at a time, one nail at a time, building something that felt less like a shelter and more like a statement. "We're still here. We're not done yet." The neighbors came and went throughout the construction, bringing what they could spare and staying to work when time allowed. Ben Mercer returned 3 times, each visit bringing new supplies and his son's strong back. Sarah Holloway brought food and stayed to cook it, working alongside Evelyn in the makeshift outdoor kitchen and swapping recipes in low, companionable voices. Even a few of the ranch hands who'd mocked Caleb for hiring an old woman showed up, their expressions sheepish, their hands ready to work. Nobody mentioned the mockery. They just worked. And slowly, grudgingly, Caleb began to understand something he'd forgotten during his years of isolation. The frontier was brutal, yes, but it was also bound by invisible threads of obligation and survival. You helped your neighbor because someday you'd need help too. You shared what you had because someday you'd have nothing. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was pragmatism dressed up in decency. But it felt like kindness anyway. By the time the walls were finished and the roof was sealed, September had arrived and the air had begun to cool. The scorched grass was starting to show the first tentative signs of recovery, tiny green shoots pushing up through the ash. The creek ran clear again, fed by late summer rains, and the animals had settled back into a wary routine. On the day they moved into the new cabin, Evelyn stood in the center of the single room and looked around with quiet satisfaction. "It'll do," she said simply. Caleb set down the box of salvaged kitchen items and glanced at her. "You sure? It's not much." "It's enough." She walked to the window and looked out at the valley, her expression distant. "I've lived in worse, worked in worse. This has something those places didn't." "What's that?" She turned to face him, and her eyes were softer than he'd ever seen them. "Feels like it's mine. Ours. Not something I'm borrowing until someone decides I'm too slow to keep." The words hit him harder than they should have. He thought about the old cabin, the one he'd lived in alone for 7 years, and realized it had never felt like his either. It had been a place to exist, nothing more, a box to keep the world out. This was different. This had been built with help, with purpose, with the knowledge that two people would share it. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. They spent the rest of the day arranging what little they had. Evelyn claimed the loft for herself, just as she had in the old cabin, and Caleb set up his bedroll near the hearth. The furniture was minimal. A table Ben had contributed, 2 mismatched chairs, a shelf for food, and dishes. But Evelyn made it feel like more, draping a faded quilt over the back of one chair and setting wildflowers in a chipped tin cup on the table. That night, she cooked their first meal in the new cabin, venison stew from a deer one of the ranch hands had brought, bread she'd baked in the outdoor oven, and the last of Sarah's preserved peaches for dessert. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation, but the silence was comfortable now, familiar. As Caleb scraped the last of the stew from his bowl, he heard a sound outside. Soft footsteps, tentative, followed by the creak of the porch boards. He tensed, reaching instinctively for the rifle that wasn't there anymore. Evelyn raised a hand. It's all right. I know who it is. She rose and walked to the door, opening it to reveal the boy. The same skinny, hollow-eyed child who'd appeared weeks ago, back when the cabin was still whole and the world hadn't burned. He stood on the porch now, barefoot and shivering in the cooling night air, his eyes fixed on the ground. You hungry? Evelyn asked gently. The boy nodded, still not looking up. Evelyn stepped aside. Come in then. The boy hesitated, glancing past her at Caleb with obvious wariness. Caleb set down his spoon and tried to look less intimidating, though he wasn't sure he succeeded. It's all right, Evelyn repeated. You're safe here. Slowly the boy stepped inside. Evelyn guided him to the table and set a bowl of stew in front of him, along with a thick slice of bread. The boy fell on the food like a starving animal, shoving it into his mouth so fast he barely chewed. Caleb watched in silence, a knot forming in his chest. He'd seen hunger before. Hell, he'd felt it himself during the lean years. But there was something about watching a child eat like that, with the desperate urgency of someone who didn't know where the next meal was coming from, that made him feel sick. Slow down, Evelyn said softly, laying a hand on the boy's shoulder. There's more if you want it. No one's going to take it from you. The boy paused, his eyes flicking up to her face, searching for a lie. Finding none, he slowed, though his hand still trembled around the spoon. When he'd finished the first bowl, Evelyn refilled it without comment. And when he'd finished that one too, she wrapped the remaining bread in a cloth and handed it to him. For tomorrow, she said, and the day after, if you stretch it. The boy stared at the bundle, then at her, his eyes wide and shining with something that might have been tears. Thank you, he whispered. It was the first time Caleb had heard him speak. What's your name? Evelyn asked. Jesse? Well, Jesse, you're welcome here any time. Understand? You get hungry, you come by. We'll feed you. The boy nodded, clutching the bread to his chest like a treasure, and slipped back out into the night. After he was gone, Caleb turned to Evelyn. How many are there? Kids like him? She sighed and sat back down at the table. Too many. Families up in the hills barely scraping by. Some of them got hit by the fire, lost what little they had. Others were poor before and are worse off now. She met his eyes. I've been feeding them when they come. Hope that's all right. It's more than all right. Caleb hesitated, then added, but we can't feed the whole valley. We don't have enough. I know. Her voice was heavy with the weight of that knowledge. But we can feed the ones who ask. That's something, at least. He wanted to argue, wanted to point out the practical impossibility of what she was proposing, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, he knew she was right. Turning away a hungry child wasn't practical either. It was just cruel. All right, he said finally. We feed who we can. Evelyn smiled, tired but genuine, and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Thank you, Caleb. Her touch was brief, almost fleeting, but it left a warmth that lingered long after she'd climbed the ladder to the loft and blown out her candle. Caleb lay awake by the hearth, staring at the dying embers, and thought about the boy, about the fire, about the cabin rising from the ashes and the neighbors who'd helped build it. About the fact that for the first time in 7 years, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself. It was terrifying, and it was the best thing he'd felt in longer than he could remember. The days grew shorter as autumn settled over the valley, bringing with it cooler nights and the first hard frosts. Caleb worked the land as best he could, clearing the scorched fields and preparing them for next year's planting. It was hard, exhausting labor made harder by the fact that his body was still recovering from the fire. But he pushed through, driven by a stubborn refusal to let the valley defeat him. Evelyn, meanwhile, turned the cabin into something that felt almost like a home. She planted a small kitchen garden near the door, coaxing late-season vegetables from the ash-enriched soil. She mended their clothes, repaired the tools that had survived, and even fashioned a crude chair from scrap wood when Caleb's back started giving him trouble. And every evening, without fail, she cooked. The meals were simple, born of necessity and scarcity, but they were good. Better than good. She had a gift for making something out of nothing, for turning a handful of beans and a scrap of salt pork into a meal that filled the belly and lifted the spirit. Caleb found himself looking forward to supper each night, not just for the food, but for the ritual of it. The two of them sitting across from each other at the table, sharing the day's small victories and defeats. It was during one of those quiet suppers that Evelyn finally told him her story. They'd just finished eating and were lingering over the last of the coffee when she set down her cup and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about why I left Double Creek." Caleb straightened, surprised. In all the weeks she'd been there, she'd never volunteered much about her past. He'd assumed it was too painful to talk about. "You don't have to," he said carefully. "I know, but I want to." She took a breath. "I told you they let me go because I was too old. That's true as far as it goes, but it's not the whole truth." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and Caleb waited in silence. "I worked at Double Creek for 23 years, she continued. "Started when I was 47, right after my husband died. Didn't have any children, didn't have any skills except cooking, so I took the job and did it as best I could. The ranch hands liked me. The foreman respected me. I thought I'd work there until I couldn't work anymore, and then they'd let me stay on in some capacity. Help with mending or cleaning or something." Her voice was steady, but there was a thread of bitterness running beneath it. "But last spring, the owner's son took over the operation. Young man, full of ideas about efficiency and modernization. He looked at the books and decided I was costing too much. Said they could hire 2 younger cooks for what they were paying me, and those cooks would work twice as fast." She smiled faintly, without humor. "He wasn't wrong. I am slower than I used to be. My hands shake sometimes. I can't stand for hours without my back seizing up." "That doesn't mean—" Caleb started, but she raised a hand. "Let me finish." She took another breath. "So they let me go. Gave me a month's pay and the mule and told me I'd done good work. They weren't cruel about it. They were just practical. And I understood that, I really did. But understanding didn't make it hurt less." She looked down at her hands, studying the lines and scars etched into the skin. "I spent a week just riding," she said quietly. "Didn't know where I was going. Didn't care. I felt like the world had used me up and thrown me away. And I couldn't see any reason to keep fighting." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. "Then I heard about you. Man living alone in the valley, barely scraping by, too stubborn to ask for help. And I thought, maybe there's still one person left who needs what I can do." Caleb's throat tightened. "Evelyn, I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," she interrupted gently. "I'm telling you because you need to understand something. When that fire came and you told me to run, I couldn't. Not because I'm brave, but because running would have meant admitting they were right. That I am too old, too slow, too useless to matter." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "I needed to prove I could still fight, still save something, still be worth keeping around." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Caleb stared at her, this small, fierce woman who'd survived decades of hardship and loss and still refused to break, and felt something shift inside him. "You're not useless," he said hoarsely. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." Evelyn's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she blinked them back. "I don't feel strong. Most days I just feel tired." Then you're tired and strong. He leaned forward, his voice fierce. You hear me? The world can say whatever it wants about age and speed and usefulness, but I've seen what you can do. I've watched you work and cook and fight and refuse to give up even when everything was burning down around you. That's not useless. That's everything. A tear slipped down her cheek and she wiped it away quickly, almost angrily. Damn it, Caleb. I didn't mean to cry. It's all right. It's not. I hate crying. Then be mad instead. He managed a small smile. You're good at that too. Isha, despite herself, Evelyn laughed, a short, sharp sound that broke the tension. She shook her head and stood, collecting their cups. You're a strange man, Caleb Rourke. So I've been told. She paused at the basin, her back to him, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. Thank you for listening and for letting me stay. You don't have to thank me for that. I know, but I'm going to anyway. She washed the dishes in silence, and Caleb sat at the table staring at the fire, thinking about everything she'd said, about the world's casual cruelty and the quiet courage it took to keep going anyway, about the fact that he'd almost turned her away that first day, and how empty his life would still be if he had. Later that night, as he lay by the hearth listening to the wind rattle the shutters, he made a silent promise. Whatever happened, however hard the winter got, he wouldn't let the world discard her again. She deserved better than that. They both did. October arrived with the first real cold, the kind that crept into your bones and made the mornings a battle just to get out from under the blankets. Ice formed on the water trough, and the wind carried the smell of snow from the high peaks. Caleb knew they needed to prepare, lay in supplies, cut firewood, make repairs before the weather turned truly brutal. But before he could focus on any of that, trouble arrived in the form of Horace Finch. Caleb was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the rattle of a wagon coming up the trail. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill, and watched as Horace's familiar rig came into view. The shopkeeper pulled to a stop in front of the cabin and climbed down, his expression sour as always. He looked around at the new structure with open disdain. So you rebuilt, he said by way of greeting. Figured you'd have given up by now. Caleb set down the axe. Why would I do that? Because this land's cursed, that's why. Fire took half the valley, drought took the other half. Anyone with sense would move on. Then I guess I don't have sense. Horace snorted. That's been clear for a while. He reached into his wagon and pulled out a ledger, flipping through the pages. You owe me money, Rourke. Supplies you bought on credit back in July. I've been patient, but I need payment. Caleb's stomach sank. He'd forgotten about the debt, or rather, he'd been trying not to think about it. The supplies he'd bought before the fire had seemed manageable at the time, but now, with the crops lost and the cabin rebuilt, he had almost nothing left. How much? He asked quietly. $47. The number hit him like a physical blow. $47 might as well have been $400. He didn't have it. Couldn't get it before spring at the earliest. I'll need time, Caleb said carefully. I can pay you in installments, a little each month. Horace's expression didn't change. I need it now, all of it. I don't have it. Then you'll have to sell something. Land, animals, I don't care, but I want my money. Caleb felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. You know I can't sell land in the middle of winter. No one's buying. Not my problem. Horace closed the ledger with a snap. You've got 2 weeks. After that, I'm taking you to the magistrate in town. He'll seize your assets to settle the debt. You bastard, Caleb said quietly. Horace smiled, thin and cruel. Just business, Rourke. Nothing personal. He climbed back onto the wagon and drove away, leaving Caleb standing in the yard, his hands clenched into fists. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face tight with concern. I heard. How bad is it? Bad. Caleb turned to look at her. If I can't pay him in 2 weeks, he'll take everything, the land, the animals, maybe even the cabin. She was silent for a long moment, thinking. Then she said, I have some money saved. Not much, but maybe enough to... No. Caleb cut her off, his voice firm. You've already given enough. I'm not taking what little you have left. Then what are you going to do? He didn't have an answer, just stood there in the cold October wind, staring at the horizon, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. For the first time since the fire, he felt truly defeated. Evelyn didn't press him for an answer. She simply stood in the doorway watching him with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to the fear he was trying to hide. After a long moment, she turned and went back inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the cold wind that cut through his worn jacket like a knife. Caleb picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, driving the blade down with more force than necessary. Each crack of splitting timber was a small release of the frustration building inside him. $47. It might as well have been a fortune. He worked through the afternoon until his shoulders burned and his hands were raw, but the physical pain was easier to bear than the weight of the debt hanging over him. That evening, Evelyn served a quiet supper of beans and cornbread, and neither of them spoke about Horace's visit. But the silence felt different now, heavier, charged with worry. After they'd eaten, Caleb sat by the fire whittling a piece of wood into nothing useful, just needing something to do with his hands. "I could ask Ben Mercer for work," he said finally. "Extra labor through the winter, maybe earn enough to—" "He doesn't have the money to pay you," Evelyn interrupted gently. "The fire hit his place too. He's barely holding on himself." Caleb knew she was right, but he needed to say something, needed to feel like he was trying. "Then I'll ride to town, find work at the mill or the freight company." "In winter? They're not hiring. You know that." He threw the stick into the fire harder than he meant to, sending up a shower of sparks. "Then what the hell am I supposed to do, Evelyn? Just let him take everything?" She was quiet for a moment, then rose from her chair and walked over to the shelf where she kept her few personal belongings. She pulled down a small leather pouch and brought it to the table, setting it down between them with a soft clink of coins. $32, she said. "Everything I have left." Caleb stared at the pouch, his throat tightening. "I already told you. I know what you told me, but you're not taking it. We're pooling it." Her voice was firm, brooking no argument. "This is my home too now. If Horace takes your land, I lose my place just the same. So this isn't charity, Caleb, it's survival." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she'd already given too much, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't offering out of pity, she was stating a fact. "That still leaves us $15 short," he said quietly. "I know, but it's a start." She sat back down, folding her hands on the table. "We have 2 weeks. That's enough time to figure something out." Caleb wasn't so sure, but he nodded anyway because what else could he do? That night, he lay awake long after Evelyn had gone up to the loft, staring at the ceiling beams and trying to think of a solution that didn't exist. Every possibility he turned over in his mind led to the same dead end. He had nothing to sell that anyone wanted, no skills valuable enough to earn $15 in 2 weeks, no favors to call in. For the first time since the fire, he felt the old familiar weight of despair settling back over him like a heavy blanket. Morning came cold and gray, with frost coating every surface and the first thin layer of ice forming on the creek. Caleb woke stiff and unrested, but he forced himself up and went about the morning chores with mechanical efficiency. He fed the animals, checked the water supply, and split more wood while Evelyn made breakfast. When he came inside, she had coffee waiting and 2 plates of fried eggs, and the last of yesterday's bread. They ate in silence, both lost in their own thoughts, until a knock at the door startled them both. Caleb opened it to find Jesse standing on the porch, the skinny boy who'd been coming for meals. But he wasn't alone this time. Behind him stood 2 more children, a girl who looked about 12 with dark braided hair, and a smaller boy, maybe 6, with a face so thin his eyes looked huge. "Morning, Mr. Rourke," Jesse said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're hungry." Evelyn appeared beside Caleb, taking in the 3 children with a practiced eye. "Come in, all of you." They filed inside, shy and uncertain, and Evelyn immediately set about preparing more food. She stretched what they had, adding water to the eggs to make them go further, slicing the bread thin, rationing the precious bit of butter they had left. The children ate slowly this time, savoring each bite, and Caleb found himself watching them with a mixture of compassion and despair. How many more were out there? How many families struggling just like his, trying to survive a winter that promised to be brutal? After the children had eaten, the girl, who introduced herself as Meg, spoke up. "Ma said to thank you for the food, Said if you need any help around the place, she can send Jesse and me to work. We're good workers. Evelyn smiled gently. Tell your mother we appreciate that. But you don't need to work for food. You're welcome here whenever you need a meal. Meg's eyes widened with something that might have been disbelief or gratitude or both. You mean that? I do. The children left shortly after, each carrying a small bundle of food wrapped in cloth, and Evelyn closed the door behind them with a heavy sigh. We can't keep this up, Caleb said quietly. Not if we're trying to save money. I know. Evelyn turned to face him, her expression troubled. But I can't turn them away either. Not when they're starving. He understood. He felt the same pull, the impossible choice between practical survival and basic human decency. But understanding didn't make it any easier. The next few days passed in a blur of worry and work. Caleb took on every odd job he could find in the valley, mending fence for Sarah Holloway, hauling firewood for an elderly couple whose son had died in the war, even cleaning out a barn in exchange for a sack of oats. He came home each night exhausted and filthy, with a few coins that felt insignificant against the growing debt. Evelyn, meanwhile, worked miracles with their dwindling supplies, stretching every ingredient to its limit and still somehow managing to feed the children who continued to show up at their door. Some days it was just Jesse. Other days there were 5 or 6 of them, thin and hollow-eyed, clutching each other's hands. She never turned any of them away. By the end of the first week, they'd managed to scrape together another $8 through Caleb's labor and Evelyn's careful rationing. Combined with her savings, they had $40, still 7 short of what Horace demanded. Caleb sat at the table that night, counting and recounting the coins as if the total might magically change. It didn't. We're not going to make it, he said finally, the words tasting bitter. Evelyn was darning socks by lamplight, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency despite the dim light. Not with what we're doing now, no. Then what do you suggest? She set down the sock and looked at him thoughtfully. There might be one option. It's not ideal, but it's something. What? The children, or rather, their families. She leaned forward, warming to the idea. Most of them don't have money, but they have other things. Skills, labor, goods they can trade. If we ask the Valley for help, not as charity, but as a community effort, maybe we could find what we need. Caleb shook his head. I can't ask people to solve my problems. They've got their own troubles. You're not asking them to solve your problems. You're asking them to invest in their own community. Evelyn's voice grew more animated. Think about it, Caleb. If Horace takes this land, he'll sell it to someone from outside the valley. Someone who doesn't know these people, doesn't care about them. But if you keep it, this place stays a refuge. For the children, for the families struggling to get by, for anyone who needs help. That's a nice idea, but it's more than an idea. It's the truth. She reached across the table and gripped his hand firmly. You've become important to this valley, whether you realize it or not. People see what we're doing here. They see us feeding hungry children and helping where we can. That matters to them. And if we explain the situation, I think they'll help. Caleb wanted to believe her, but years of isolation had taught him not to rely on anyone. And if they don't, if they can't, then we'll know we tried everything. Her grip tightened. But sitting here counting coins and watching the deadline approach isn't working either. We have to do something different. He looked into her eyes and saw the same stubborn determination that had kept her fighting the fire when anyone sensible would have run. And he realized that somewhere along the way, he'd started trusting her judgment more than his own. All right, he said quietly. We ask. The next morning, they rode out to visit the neighboring homesteads. Caleb felt awkward and exposed, hating the vulnerability of having to explain his situation to people he barely knew. But Evelyn had no such hesitation. She stated the facts plainly and without shame. Caleb owed money, they were short, and if the debt wasn't paid, the land would be lost. We're not asking for charity, she said at each stop. But if you have work that needs doing, or goods you're willing to trade for labor, we'd be grateful for the opportunity. The responses were mixed. Some families struggling themselves could offer nothing but sympathy. Others promised to think about it. But a few surprised him. Ben Mercer, despite his own financial troubles, offered $3 outright. Call it payment for all the times you've helped me over the years, he said gruffly when Caleb tried to refuse. Sarah Holloway traded 2 chickens and a sack of flour in exchange for Evelyn's promise to teach her daughter some proper cooking techniques. A young couple who'd recently settled in the valley hired Caleb to build them a storage shed, paying him $4 up front. By the end of 3 days, they'd accumulated goods and cash worth roughly $5 more. Combined with what they already had, they were still $2 short. $2. Such a small amount, and yet it might as well have been a mountain. The night before the deadline, Caleb sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the ridge. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, beautiful and indifferent to his troubles. Dust lay at his feet, the old hound's breathing slow and labored. He'd been declining lately, sleeping more, eating less. Caleb reached down and scratched behind his ears, feeling the prominent bones beneath the graying fur. "We tried, old boy," he murmured. "Can't say we didn't try." The door opened behind him and Evelyn stepped out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. She sat down beside him on the steps, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "About what?" "About what happens if we can't pay tomorrow." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then Horace takes the land and we figure out somewhere else to go." "No." He turned to look at her, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "No," she repeated. "I'm not leaving, and neither are you. Evelyn, we won't have a choice. There's always a choice." She met his eyes, and in the fading light he saw something fierce and unyielding. "When the fire came, I chose to stay and fight. When you told me to run, I chose to stand my ground. And tomorrow, when Horace comes for his money, I'm choosing to believe that somehow, some way, we'll find what we need." "That's not rational," Caleb said, though without much conviction. "Probably not, but rational hasn't gotten us very far, has it?" She smiled, sad and gentle. "Sometimes you just have to have faith that things will work out." He wanted to argue, wanted to point out that faith didn't pay debts or save land, but he couldn't bring himself to crush the hope in her eyes. So he just nodded and looked back at the sunset, trying to believe in something he couldn't see. They sat together in silence as darkness fell, and the first stars appeared, cold and distant. And somewhere in that silence, Caleb made a decision. Whatever happened tomorrow, he wouldn't let Evelyn face it alone. They'd built this together, fought for it together, and if they lost it, they'd lose it together. That was worth something, at least. Morning arrived too soon, gray and cold with the threat of snow in the air. Caleb woke early and went through his morning routine in a daze, feeding the animals, checking the water, splitting wood. Everything felt both achingly normal and surreal, like the last ordinary moments before something fundamental changed forever. Evelyn made breakfast, but neither of them ate much. They just sat at the table, drinking coffee and watching the clock on the shelf tick toward midday, when Horace had said he'd arrive. At 11:30, they heard the wagon. Caleb stood and walked to the window, his heart sinking as he saw Horace's rig coming up the trail. But there was another wagon behind it, and another behind that, and people on horseback, a whole procession winding its way toward the cabin. "What the hell, he muttered. Evelyn joined him at the window, her eyes widening. "That's Ben, and Sarah, and Caleb, that's half the valley." They stepped out onto the porch just as the first wagon pulled to a stop. Horace climbed down, his expression sour, clearly annoyed by the crowd that had followed him. "I'm here for my money, Rourke," he announced loudly. Before Caleb could respond, Ben Mercer stepped forward from the gathered group. "And we're here to make sure he can pay you." Horace's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't concern you, Mercer." "Like hell it doesn't. This man's part of our community. What affects him affects all of us." Ben turned to Caleb. "How much are you short?" Caleb's throat felt tight. $2. A murmur ran through the crowd. Then Sarah Holloway stepped forward, pulling coins from her pocket. "I've got 60 cents. A young ranch hand Caleb barely knew offered 40 cents. An elderly woman gave a quarter. One by one, people came forward, placing coins in a hat that Ben held out. Small amounts, most of them, pennies and nickels and dimes, but they added up. Caleb watched in stunned silence as the valley emptied its pockets to save his land. When the last person had contributed, Ben counted the coins carefully. $2.35. He looked up at Horace with grim satisfaction. "More than enough. Horace's face had gone red. This is highly irregular. I don't care if it's irregular, Ben interrupted. It's legal. You said you wanted your money. Here it is. He handed the hat to Caleb. Go on, pay the man. Caleb took the hat with shaking hands and walked over to where he'd left his and Evelyn's pooled savings. He counted out $47 exactly, his vision blurring slightly as he realized what had just happened. The valley had saved him. These people, most of whom he'd barely known a few months ago, had come together to make sure he didn't lose everything. He handed the money to Horace, who counted it twice, his expression growing more sour with each bill. It's all there, Horace finally admitted grudgingly. Then we're square, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. For now. Horace shoved the money into his coat and climbed back onto his wagon. But don't come asking for credit again, Rourke. You're a bad investment. He drove away without another word, and as soon as he was out of sight, the tension broke. People started laughing and talking, clapping Caleb on the shoulder and congratulating him. Evelyn stood on the porch, tears streaming down her face, making no effort to hide them. Ben walked over and gripped Caleb's hand firmly. You've helped a lot of folks in this valley, whether you knew it or not. We don't forget that kind of thing. I don't know what to say, Caleb managed. Don't have to say anything. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep feeding those kids. Keep your door open. Ben smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. That's payment enough. The crowd stayed for a while, celebrating with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from a small victory in a hard world. Evelyn brought out what food she had, and people added to it, bread and cheese and even a bottle of whiskey that got passed around. It wasn't a feast, but it felt like one. As the afternoon wore on and people began to drift away, Caleb found himself standing in the yard watching them go. Evelyn came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. You were right, he said quietly. About the valley. About community. About all of it. We were right, she corrected gently. Neither of us could have done this alone. He squeezed her hand, and they stood there together as the last wagon disappeared down the trail and silence settled over the homestead once more. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not empty, not lonely, just peaceful. That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Evelyn pulled out a worn leather journal that Caleb had never seen before. The cover was cracked and faded, and the pages were yellowed with age. What's that? He asked. Recipes, she said, running her hand over the cover with obvious affection. From all the places I've worked, all the people I've cooked for. I've been keeping it for 40 years. She opened it carefully, and Caleb could see page after page of handwritten notes, ingredients, instructions, little comments in the margins. Some were in Evelyn's careful script, but others were in different hands, as if people had contributed their own favorites. This one's from a woman I worked with in Kansas, Evelyn said, pointing to a recipe for apple cake. And this one's from a ranch cook in Colorado who taught me how to make biscuits that actually rise. She turned more pages. Here's one from my mother, and one from my husband, back when we were first married. Caleb listened, fascinated, as she went through the book, telling the story behind each recipe. They weren't just instructions for making food. They were memories, connections to people and places long gone. Why are you showing me this? He asked quietly. Evelyn looked up at him, her expression serious. Because I want you to have it, if something happens to me. Nothing's going to happen to you. Maybe not, but I'm 70 years old, Caleb. I'm not young, and I'm not getting any younger. She pressed the journal into his hands. This is my legacy. These recipes, these memories. I don't have children to pass them on to, so I'm giving them to you. His throat tightened. Evelyn, promise me something, she interrupted. Promise me that when I'm gone, you'll use these. You'll cook for people. You'll keep feeding the hungry and taking care of the lost. Promise me this place will stay a refuge. Caleb stared down at the journal, feeling the weight of what she was asking. It wasn't just about food. It was about continuing what they'd built together, about keeping alive the small spark of generosity and community they'd managed to nurture in this harsh valley. I promise, he said hoarsely. Evelyn smiled, relieved, and settled back in her chair. Good, that's good. They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling softly, the journal resting in Caleb's lap like a sacred trust. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and quiet, covering the scarred land in a blanket of white. The snow fell through the night and into the morning, transforming the valley into something almost beautiful. The scorched earth disappeared beneath a layer of pristine white, and for a few hours the world looked clean and new, as if the fire had never happened at all. Caleb woke to find Evelyn already up, standing at the window and watching the snow with a distant expression. She didn't turn when he rose from his bedroll, just continued staring out at the transformed landscape. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Just thinking," she said. "About winters past. About how many I've seen." There was something in her voice that made him uneasy, a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. But before he could press her, she turned and smiled, and the moment passed. "Come on," she said. "Those children will be hungry, and the snow will make the walk harder for them." She was right. By mid-morning, Jessie arrived with Meg and the little boy, all three of them shivering and wet from trudging through the deepening drifts. Evelyn immediately set them by the fire and wrapped them in blankets while she prepared a hot breakfast of oatmeal sweetened with the last of their honey. Over the next few days, more children came despite the snow, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups. Evelyn fed them all, and when the weather was too severe for them to make the journey home, she let them sleep on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in whatever blankets and furs she could spare. The cabin became a refuge in truth, not just in name. Caleb worked through the early winter doing whatever needed doing, cutting firewood, repairing the fence, hunting when the weather allowed. The deer were scarce and wary, but he managed to bring down a young buck that kept them supplied with meat for 2 weeks. He rationed it carefully, knowing that every scrap would need to stretch as far as possible. Evelyn continued to perform her daily miracles with food, transforming simple ingredients into meals that satisfied body and spirit both. She taught Meg how to make bread that rose properly, showed Jessie how to skin and clean a rabbit, and patiently answered the younger children's endless questions about cooking and life and everything in between. Watching her with them, Caleb realized something that should have been obvious from the start. She'd never stopped being a mother, even without children of her own. She'd been mothering ranch hands and drifters and lost souls for decades, pouring into them the care she had no one else to give. And now she was pouring it into these valley children who had so little. December arrived with bitter cold and shorter days. The snow kept falling, piling up in drifts that reached halfway up the cabin walls. Caleb had to shovel a path to the stable every morning, and even then the animals huddled together for warmth, their breath steaming in the frozen air. Dusk grew weaker. The old hound spent most of his time sleeping by the fire, rising only when Caleb called him for his meals. He ate less each day, and his breathing had developed a wet, rattling quality that Caleb recognized as the beginning of the end. One particularly cold night, as wind howled around the cabin and snow battered the windows, Dust struggled to his feet and limped over to where Caleb sat by the fire. The dog rested his gray head on Caleb's knee and looked up at him with cloudy eyes that still held a spark of the loyalty he'd shown for 15 years. Caleb scratched behind his ears, feeling the fragile skull beneath the fur. "I know, old friend. I know you're tired." Dust's tail thumped weakly against the floor. "You've been a good dog," Caleb continued, his voice rough. "The best. You stayed when everyone else left. You never asked for much. Just a little food, a place to sleep, and someone to be loyal to." He had to stop and clear his throat. "I don't know what I would have done without you all these years." The dog sighed and closed his eyes, still resting against Caleb's leg. They sat like that for a long time, man and dog, sharing warmth and silence while the storm raged outside. Evelyn came down from the loft and joined them, sitting on Caleb's other side. She didn't say anything, just reached over and rested her hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture of comfort and solidarity. Dust died sometime in the early morning hours so peacefully that Caleb almost didn't notice. One moment the dog was breathing, shallow and slow, and the next he simply wasn't. There was no struggle, no pain that Caleb could see, just a quiet slipping away, as if the old hound had finally decided he'd done his job and could rest. Caleb buried him at first light in a spot near the cabin where Dust had liked to sleep in the summer sun. The ground was frozen solid, and it took him hours to dig a grave deep enough. By the time he finished, his hands were raw and bleeding, and his whole body ached from the effort, But he didn't stop until it was done properly. Evelyn stood beside the grave when he lowered Dust's body into it, wrapped in an old blanket. She didn't offer empty platitudes or try to minimize his grief. She just stood there with him in the bitter cold while he filled in the dirt and marked the spot with a rough wooden cross he'd fashioned from scrap lumber. "He was a good companion," she said quietly when it was done. "The best," Caleb agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. They walked back to the cabin together, and Caleb felt the absence like a physical weight. For 15 years, Dust had been the one constant in his life. The one living thing that had stayed with him through all the loneliness and hardship, and now that small, faithful presence was gone, leaving another hollow space that seemed impossible to fill. That night, Jesse and 2 other children arrived seeking shelter from another storm. Evelyn welcomed them in and set about making supper, but Caleb noticed she moved slower than usual, pausing occasionally to lean against the table as if to steady herself. "You feeling all right?" he asked when the children were occupied by the fire. "Just tired," she said, waving off his concern. "It's been a long day." But over the next week, her fatigue deepened. She still cooked and cleaned and cared for the children who came by, but the work that had once seemed effortless now left her visibly drained. She began taking afternoon naps, something she'd never done before, and Caleb caught her rubbing her chest several times as if it pained her. "You need to rest more," he told her one evening after she'd spent the day cooking for a particularly large group of children. "I rest plenty," she protested, but her voice lacked its usual firmness. "Evelyn, I'm serious. You're pushing yourself too hard." She looked at him with those sharp blue eyes, and for a moment he saw a flash of the steel that had carried her through the fire. "And what would you have me do, Caleb? Turn those children away? Let them go hungry because I'm feeling a little worn out?" "No, but then I'll keep doing what I've always done. I'll work until the work is finished." She softened slightly, seeing the worry in his face. "I appreciate your concern, truly, but this is who I am. Taking care of people is what gives my life meaning. I'm not going to stop just because I'm tired." He wanted to argue further, but he could see it would be pointless. Evelyn Ward was as stubborn as the mountains themselves, and no amount of reasoning would change her mind once it was made up. So he did the only thing he could. He tried to lighten her load. He took over more of the cooking, following her patient instructions and using her recipe journal as a guide. He wasn't as skilled as she was. His bread came out dense, and his stews were often too salty, but the children ate them anyway, and Evelyn seemed grateful for the help, even if she wouldn't admit she needed it. Christmas came quietly to the valley. There was no money for gifts or decorations, but Evelyn managed to make the day feel special anyway. She baked a cake using carefully hoarded sugar and eggs, and roasted a chicken that Sarah Holloway had traded for a week's worth of cooking lessons. 8 children showed up that afternoon, drawn by word that there would be a special meal, and Evelyn served them all with a warmth that transcended the meager offerings. After they'd eaten, she told them stories, old frontier tales of adventure and courage, of people who'd faced impossible odds and somehow prevailed. The children listened with rapt attention, and even Caleb found himself drawn in by her storytelling. She had a gift for it, painting pictures with her words that made the small cabin feel larger, the cold world outside less harsh. When the children finally left that evening, trudging back through the snow to their various homes, Evelyn collapsed into her chair by the fire with a long, shaky exhale. "That was a good day," she said softly. Caleb looked at her and saw how pale she'd become, how deeply the lines around her eyes had etched themselves. "It was. But you need to rest now." "I will." She smiled at him, tired but content. "Thank you, Caleb, for helping today, for making this place what it is." "I didn't make it anything. That was all you." "No." She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly weak. "It was both of us. Everything we've built here, we built together. Don't forget that." He squeezed her hand gently, troubled by the finality in her tone. "I won't." She nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep in the chair, her breathing shallow and uneven. Caleb carefully draped a blanket over her and then sat down across from her, watching the fire and trying not to think about what her growing frailty might mean. The new year arrived with another brutal storm that lasted 3 days. Snow piled so high that Caleb had to dig out the door every morning just to reach the animals. The temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows, and even with the fire burning constantly, the cabin never felt truly warm. Evelyn spent most of those days in bed, insisting she just needed rest. But Caleb could hear her labored breathing from downstairs, could see the gray tinge to her skin when she did come down. He wanted to ride for the doctor in town, but the storm made travel impossible, and even if he could have made it, there was no money to pay for medical care. All he could do was keep the fire burning, make sure she ate what little she would accept, and wait for the storm to break. On the fourth day, the wind finally died and the snow stopped. Caleb woke to an eerie stillness, the kind of profound quiet that only comes after a major storm. He built up the fire and was preparing to check on the animals when he heard Evelyn call his name from the loft. Her voice was weak but urgent. He climbed the ladder quickly and found her sitting up in bed, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Her face was drawn and pale, and her lips had a bluish tint that terrified him. "I need you to listen," she said before he could speak. "Don't argue, don't interrupt, just listen." "Evelyn, I'm getting the doctor. There's no time for that, and we both know it." Her voice was calm, accepting. "I'm dying, Caleb. My heart's giving out. I've known it for weeks." The words hit him like a physical blow. "No, you're just tired. You need rest, and I need you to stop pretending." She reached out and gripped his hand with what little strength she had left. "I'm 70 years old. I've lived a full life, and I've made my peace with how it ends. But before I go, I need to know you'll be all right, that you'll keep this place going." Caleb felt his eyes burning, his throat tight with grief he couldn't express. "I can't do this without you." "Yes, you can. You're stronger than you think." She paused to catch her breath, the effort clearly costing her. "Promise me you'll keep feeding those children. Keep your door open to anyone who needs help. Make this cabin a place where people know they won't be turned away." "I promise," he managed, his voice breaking. "And promise me you won't go back to being alone, that you'll stay connected to the valley, to the people here. They need you, Caleb, and you need them." "I promise." She nodded, satisfied, and settled back against the pillows. "My journal. You have it?" "Yes?" "Good. Use it. Cook for people. Share those recipes. They're all I have to leave behind, but they're more than just food. They're memories, love, connection." She smiled faintly. "They're proof that I was here, that I mattered." "You mattered," Caleb said fiercely. "You changed everything. You changed me." "I'm glad." Her eyes were starting to close, her breathing becoming more labored. "Thank you for giving me a home when no one else would. Thank you for letting me matter again." "Evelyn, hush now. I'm tired." She squeezed his hand one last time, barely more than a flutter of pressure. "Stay with me?" "I'm not going anywhere." He sat beside her bed as the morning light grew stronger, holding her hand and watching her breathe. She slipped in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words he couldn't quite make out, sometimes simply lying still and silent. As the sun reached its zenith, casting pale winter light through the small window, her breathing changed, became shallower, more irregular. Caleb felt panic rising in his chest, the desperate urge to do something, anything, to stop what was happening. But there was nothing to do except bear witness. Evelyn opened her eyes one last time and looked at him with perfect clarity. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, "of anything." Then she closed her eyes, exhaled slowly, and was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Caleb sat there holding her still warm hand, unable to move or think or process what had just happened. The woman who'd arrived on his doorstep asking for work, who'd refused to run from the fire, who'd fought for this land as fiercely as if it had always been hers, she was gone. And he was alone again. But this time the loneliness felt different. Not empty, but hollow with loss. Not the absence of connection, but the severing of something precious. He didn't know how long he sat there. Time seemed to stop, the world reduced to that small room and the terrible finality of death. Eventually, though, practical necessity reasserted itself. There were things that needed doing, rituals that needed observing. Caleb carefully arranged Evelyn's body, folding her hands across her chest and smoothing the blanket around her. She looked peaceful, almost as if she were simply sleeping. He allowed himself one moment of weakness, leaned down and kissed her forehead, whispering a thank you she couldn't hear. Then he went downstairs and began making preparations. He couldn't bury her yet. The ground was too frozen, and he couldn't dig another grave so soon after dusts. So he did what frontier people had done for generations in winter. He wrapped her carefully in clean sheets, carried her down from the loft with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior, and placed her in the stable where the cold would preserve her until spring. It felt wrong, inadequate, but it was all he could do. That night, Caleb sat alone in the cabin and stared at Evelyn's recipe journal. The leather cover was worn smooth from decades of handling, and when he opened it, the pages smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla and memories he'd never lived. He read through it slowly, cover to cover, and with each recipe came a story. Not just the ones Evelyn had told him, but new ones he could imagine. The people she'd cooked for, the places she'd been, the small kindnesses she'd dispensed with every meal. She'd spent 40 years building this collection, 40 years of caring for others through the simple act of feeding them well. And now she'd passed it to him, trusting him to continue that legacy. The weight of it was overwhelming. But as he sat there in the firelight, alone in a way he hadn't been since she'd arrived, Caleb made a decision. He wouldn't let her death be the end of what they'd built. He would honor her memory the only way that mattered, by continuing her work. The next morning, he rode to Ben Mercer's place and asked to borrow tools for building a coffin. Ben took one look at his face and understood. "She was a good woman," Ben said quietly. "The best. You need help with anything?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like to hold a service when the weather breaks. Give people a chance to pay their respects. Would you help spread the word?" "Of course." Ben gripped his shoulder firmly. "And Caleb, don't you dare think about leaving that valley. We need you there." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Caleb realized that somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being the isolated outsider and become part of something larger. The valley had claimed him just as surely as he'd claimed his land. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Over the next few weeks, Caleb kept the cabin running as best he could. He cooked simple meals using Evelyn's recipes, though nothing tasted quite as good as when she'd made them. When children showed up seeking food, he fed them without hesitation, even when supplies ran low. He opened the door to travelers caught in storms, shared what little he had, and slowly began to understand what Evelyn had meant about the cabin being a refuge. It wasn't about the structure. It was about the willingness to help, the refusal to turn people away when they needed something he could provide. In late February, the weather finally warmed enough for a burial. Caleb built a simple pine coffin and dug a grave on a small rise behind the cabin next to where dust lay. It took him 2 full days to break through the frozen earth, but he didn't complain. This was the last thing he could do for her, and he would do it properly. On the day of the service, people came from all over the valley. Ben and Sarah arrived early to help prepare. Other families followed. Some Caleb knew well, others he'd only met once or twice. Even a few of the ranch hands who'd mocked Evelyn when she first arrived showed up, their expressions properly somber. And the children came. Jesse and Meg and the little boy, along with a dozen others, all dressed in their cleanest clothes and carrying wildflowers they'd somehow found in the snow. They gathered around the grave as Caleb lowered the coffin into the earth. There was no preacher, no formal ceremony. Just Caleb standing at the head of the grave, trying to find words adequate to honor the woman who'd changed his life. "Evelyn Ward came to this valley when most people would have given up," he began, his voice rough but steady. "She was 70 years old, cast aside by a world that saw her as used up and worthless. But she wasn't worthless. She was the strongest, most generous person I've ever known." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "She taught me that survival isn't just about endurance. It's about protecting what's good in yourself and others. It's about refusing to let hardship make you cruel. She taught me that by feeding hungry children when we barely had enough for ourselves, by standing her ground when the fire came, by choosing kindness even when the world gave her every reason to become bitter." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed on. "She gave me this." He held up the recipe journal. "These are her memories, her legacy, and I promise all of you that I'll use them. That this cabin will remain a place where the hungry are fed and the lost can find shelter. Because that's what she would have wanted. That's what she lived for." He looked around at the gathered faces and saw understanding, respect, and something that might have been gratitude. Evelyn Ward mattered, he said firmly, and she always will. After the service, people lingered. They shared stories about Evelyn, small kindnesses she'd done, meals she'd cooked, words of encouragement she'd offered. Caleb listened to them all, learning things about her he'd never known, and felt his grief mixing with a strange sort of pride. She'd touched so many lives in her short time in the valley, had left an impression that would outlast her physical presence. That was no small thing. As the last of the mourners departed, Jesse approached Caleb shyly. "Mr. Rourke, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Will you still let us come for food, even though Miss Evelyn's gone?" Caleb looked down at the boy's worried face and felt something settle into place inside him. This was the test, he realized, the moment when he either honored his promise or let it die with her. "You can come any time," he said firmly. "All of you. The door's always open." Jesse's face lit up with relief. "Thank you, sir." After the boy had run off to join the other children, Caleb stood alone by the grave and looked out over the valley. Snow still covered most of the land, but he could see the first signs of spring's approach. Bare patches where the ground was beginning to thaw, the subtle lengthening of daylight. Life would go on, the seasons would turn, the valley would survive. And so would he. The months that followed were difficult. Caleb missed Evelyn with an ache that never quite faded, finding reminders of her everywhere, in the arrangement of the kitchen, in the quilt still draped over her chair, in every recipe he attempted from her journal. But he kept his promise. The cabin remained a refuge, and hardly a week went by without someone showing up seeking food or shelter or just a listening ear. He became known throughout the valley as a man you could count on, someone who'd help without asking questions or expecting repayment. It was a reputation he hadn't sought, but one he grew into with time. Jesse and Meg became regular visitors, along with several other valley children. Caleb taught them what Evelyn had taught him: how to cook simple, nourishing meals, how to stretch ingredients when money was tight, how to show kindness even when life was hard. They absorbed the lessons eagerly, and watching them grow gave Caleb a sense of purpose he'd thought lost. Spring arrived eventually, bringing rain and new grass and the slow healing of the fire-scarred land. Caleb planted a garden using seeds Sarah Holloway provided, and to his surprise, things actually grew. Not abundantly, but enough. Enough to share when the children came by. Enough to feel like he was building something rather than just surviving. One warm evening in May, as Caleb sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ben Mercer rode up. "Got something for you," Ben said, dismounting and pulling a small bundle from his saddlebag. Caleb took it, puzzled, and unwrapped the cloth to find a hand-carved sign. The wood was smooth and well-crafted, with words burned into it in neat lettering. Evelyn's Place. All welcome. "Figured the cabin needed a proper name," Ben said gruffly. "Seemed fitting." Caleb stared at the sign, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank her. She's the one who made this place what it is." Ben clapped him on the shoulder. "You're just keeping it going, and doing a damn fine job, I might add." After Ben left, Caleb hung the sign above the door. It caught the last light of the setting sun, the carved letters standing out bold and clear. He stepped back to look at it and felt, for the first time since Evelyn's death, a sense of peace. This was her legacy. Not just the recipes or the cabin or the meals shared with hungry children, but the idea that every person mattered, regardless of age or usefulness or what the world said about them. That generosity wasn't weakness, but strength. That a single life lived with courage and kindness could change everything. She'd proven that to him. Had shown him that survival on the frontier wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about protecting the fragile good in yourself and others. And now it was up to him to carry that forward. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Caleb went inside and opened Evelyn's journal to a page marked with a pressed flower. It was a recipe for apple cake, the one she'd made from her friend in Kansas. He'd never attempted it before, but there were apples from Sarah's orchard in the pantry, and tomorrow Jesse and Meg were coming by. He read through the instructions carefully, memorizing the steps, imagining Evelyn's patient voice guiding him through it. Then he closed the book and looked around the cabin, at the table where they'd shared so many meals, at the hearth where she'd cooked countless times, at the empty chair that still bore her quilt. "I won't forget," he said quietly to the silence. "I promise I won't forget." The fire crackled softly in response, warm and alive, and outside the wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of growing things. Caleb Rourke sat down in his chair and smiled, not with joy exactly, but with something deeper and more enduring: purpose, connection, legacy. The stubborn generosity of the frontier kept alive by an old woman's courage and a lonely man's promise. It wasn't much, but it was everything.